Now, this slide is one that we update each month for our reports for investors, and it overlays the Class 8 cycle and the current one. And the reason that we track this slide every month is that, at least historically in stocks, the way you made money in these names was you bought them when orders were at the bottom and going up, and you sold them when orders were at a peak and they were going down, and you actually didn't want to focus too much on builds. But I also think it's an additional data point to think about when you think about the magnitude and the timing of this pre-buy. Now, back in the late 1990s, which is what the light blue line represents, the consensus view was that there had been an overbuy of trucks. And this was because OEMs were using residual value guarantees in order to gain market share. That really came back to bite the industry in 01 and 02. For instance, my friends at Volvo have a slide that showed two ads from that period, one of a late model Class 8 truck, one of a late model Ford Explorer. And the asking price for both trucks was about $27,000 each. If we look at that really big peak in the yellow line, there were about 240,000 more Class 8 trucks ordered ahead of the 07 emissions reg compared to the so-called freewheeling 99 peak. Now, there are many other factors at play there, but 246,000 trucks is a lot. I mean, arguably, that's a full year of normalized demand. And I'm not making the argument that an entire year has been pulled forward, but I do think that the financial markets do underestimate how much demand has been pulled forward into 05 and 06. Might be interesting to hear what our executives have to think about that. Now, recall I mentioned that we do a macro overlay to increase our confidence in our bottoms-up forecast. This slide takes a brief look at freight growth. And this is important because we found about a 60% correlation between year-over-year growth in ATA truck tonnage and the number of Class 8 trucks ordered. And the first point I wanted to make was that freight has been declining for all year. It created some noise initially January 06, as the conventional thinking was that it was driven by an inventory adjustment out of big box retailers. We didn't hear much about freight declines again until peak shipping season, or rather the lack thereof. And this is actually where the year-over-year decline started to accelerate in freight. Now, by the same token, we've seen a gradual deterioration in yields net of fuel from the public truckload carriers, admittedly off a very high base. We've also seen mixed operating ratios, again off a high base, but on the downward trend. And I point these out because here again we found a strong correlation between Class 8 orders and carrier profitability. So 2007 was likely shaping up to be at least a downtick in the cycle from a macro perspective. You add in payback from the pre-buy in 05 and 06, and there's probably not going to be a lot that's encouraging, at least in the first half of the year. But again, the good news is I think we'll bottom out sometime this summer, and our bottoms-up work suggests that we might exit 07 at a 280 run rate as the industry marches through another emission cycle. I think the two biggest risks to this are, number one, if 07 turns into a recession, not a mid-cycle breather as I believe it will be. I'm not an economist, but I actually think a recession scenario is pretty low probability. I'd also add that the chief economist at Bear Stearns believes that the economy is a lot stronger than most people think. The second biggest risk, I would argue, to a sharp back half recovery is the supply chain ready to snap back on relatively short notice? Now recall back to early 2004. There was a 40% sequential increase in Class 8 builds over the course of only 3 months. And if you look back at that period, there were some OEMs that just weren't ready for it. The term red tag became very popular in a lot of earnings reports around March 2004. So okay, enough with 2007. Let's start thinking about some of those top 10 trends for the next 10 years. I'll briefly frame them, and our panel of industry executives will help flesh them out. And sitting here today, I was actually encouraged to see several of these trends already discussed today. So I'd actually also think of this as sort of a summary for most of the trends that we've seen today. This is not an exhaustive list, though. Number 10 is extension of life cycles, and this really cuts across a lot of areas. The useful lives of both components and vehicles will continue to improve. Terry Keating's going to spend some more time on this, but for example, will we see more rebuilds move away from OEM control and towards secondary markets? Number 9 is global consolidation. Consolidation is rising at all levels, at OEMs, at fleets, suppliers. Witness Mann's hostile bid for Scania in Western Europe. And my view is if that deal falls through, a Mann-Navistar combination would make a lot of sense. So is this a threat or is it an opportunity? Will larger OEMs try to squeeze supplier prices even harder, or does it represent an opportunity to sell more into that larger OEM? Number 8 is decreasing U.S. dependence on foreign oil. Certainly this trend has multiple drivers, political, economic, and even environmental. Think hybrid powertrains, fuel cells, even good old humble biodiesel. Number 7 is vertical integration. Both International Truck and PACCAR will start making their own 13-liter engines by 2009, as well as other types of engines. Volvo has increased its internal engine penetration rate from about 10% in '94 to about 65% today. Volvo has also recently announced its own automated transmission, and my prediction is that International Truck is going to announce a private label transmission in the next 2 to 3 years. So how does a supplier respond to that trend? Number 6 is vehicle idling. This creates demand for auxiliary power units or APUs. Entrants we've seen there include Thermo King, Eaton, and Carrier Transicold. But some fleets tell me that they don't want the added weight of an APU. So are there other potential opportunities to capitalize on this trend away from vehicle idling? Number 5 is global sourcing. International Truck seeks to buy $1 billion worth of components through its JV partner Mahindra & Mahindra by 2009. Are you on the wrong side of that trade? PACCAR just opened its first purchasing office in China, and Wabash National purchases more than 90% of its direct materials within 300 miles of its facility, and it's telling investors it's going to change that over the next few years. So is this a threat or an opportunity for suppliers, particularly those that have a global footprint? Also, at the OEM level, how do we avoid just competing away all these savings we're all getting from global sourcing? And finally, remember I cautioned earlier that if truck demand rebounds suddenly late in 2007, the entire supply chain needs to refill very quickly. Well, how does the recent wave of global sourcing impact that? I mean, have we really thought that lead times are significantly lengthened when we source from the other side of the world, particularly if we're using ocean freight and intermodal moves, which are slow and we don't really always know when the stuff's going to get there? Number 4 is safety. One example of many is the stopping distance rule. NHTSA has a new 60-mile-per-hour rule in the works. There had been talk of a 75-mile-per-hour rule or a brake fade test. Now, if either one of those additions were to pass, we would probably see a shift away from drum brakes and towards air disc brakes in North America. Would that impact your business? Number 3 is the driver shortage. Certainly this gets plenty of press coverage, and we could probably add a technician shortage to this growing trend. Jim Sweetenham from Eaton will spend a little time on the growing labor shortage that our industry is facing. Number 2 is the shrinking diesel emission strike zone. This was the title of my presentation last year, and the key takeaway from that was that emissions regulations only go in one direction, they get stricter. So are there ways you can position your business to benefit from that? And finally, the number 1 trend that we've identified is freight of the nation, the lurking congestion epidemic. This is probably the widest sweeping trend of all that we looked at. The American Highway Users Alliance published a 100-page report on this subject recently, and most of the statistics that I'll mention here are from that group. Congestion impacts a lot of things. Fuel consumption. There are 5.7 billion gallons of fuel wasted annually due to congestion. Safety. More crowded highways increase the likelihood of fatalities. Air pollution. Vehicles and stop-and-go traffic emit far more carbon monoxide and volatile organic compounds than they do when they don't have to have frequent acceleration and braking. Driver productivity. There are 3.5 billion hours of delays each year in the top 75 metro markets. Stated another way, a freight move during rush hour takes 52% longer due to congestion. Drivers sitting in traffic are not generating revenue. If we include just travel time and excess fuel, the annual cost is $71 billion. And if you throw in the environmental and safety impact, the cost would be much, much higher. Now that is a market opportunity. What's more is it's bad and it's getting worse. Between 1960 and 2003, total highway miles grew 12%. Total freight tonnage grew 150%. If you assume freight grows at 3% annually, tonnage will double again by 2030. Highway miles at the current trajectory might only increase about 5% over that time. So you think you have a long commute now. And wait another 5 years or so. The most important slide in my deck is the last one, so I really want to make sure you get all this information, take it home with you, and digest it. Some really important SEC disclosure from our lawyers. With that, we're going to move on to Gary Edwards, President and CEO of Philip & Temro.